The storm didn't wait. It clawed over the mountains with the fury of a thing cheated, bitter and personal. It came before the roots of spring could settle, dragging sleet and wind through every open crack like claws through hide. There was no warning but the sudden hush that settled on the valley like a curse. Then came the thunder, not from the sky but from the brittle groans of cabins as they gave way one by one, crushed under their own soaked timbers. And through it all, her house, her stupid little house of mud, stood still. They'd mocked her from the beginning. Men with hands like axe handles and minds closed tight as trap jaws. She was just the widow from Missouri, new to the flats east of the Snake River. No kin, no husband, and certainly no right to build anything with her own hands, they said. But what they couldn't see, or refused to, was that her hands were smarter than theirs ever had to be, because hers had held children who didn't make it, had shoveled soil where no preacher stood, had lifted roofs in rains when nobody else would. Her name was Lydia Morrow, and long before the collapse began, long before the last good tree in the canyon was felled for someone else's proper cabin, she was already building something better, something stronger, not just for herself, but for the memory of every woman who'd ever been left behind to dig herself out with bare fingers. It started with the mud. They saw her down near the creek bed, mixing it in a worn wooden box, that same wide square thing her husband once hauled flour in, back when wagons still ran from St. Louis, and not just from trouble. She had no horse, so she walked, no proper spade, so she used a frying pan for a scoop. Folks laughed. They called her bricks kitchen bricks, and snickered when she dried them on the grass like biscuits. Tom Rayner spit tobacco in the dirt one afternoon and said loud enough for everyone, "Might as well build a chimney out of cornbread. That woman's gonna be sleeping in a pancake come winter." Lydia didn't look up. That was her secret. She never rose to it, never fought back with words. She just made another brick. She stacked them slowly, not with cement, not even with lime, just with more mud, thicker, sticky from the yellow clay under her lot. It didn't look like much, and for most of the summer it stood no taller than a pigsty. The other men built big, proud cabins from pine. They cut trees together, sweating and boasting. Some of them had wives helping too, but none like Lydia. She worked alone. Her walls went up without beams, without nails, just wet earth, shaped square and hardened in the sun. They said she was making a tomb, that her home wouldn't see first frost. They were half right. The first snow came before Halloween that year, and with it came the weight. One cabin buckled on the north slope, James Fowler's, then another along the creek. Men blamed rot, the way the greenwood had warped, or how fast they'd thrown it up. Nobody blamed the pride, but pride was what bent those beams and split those roofs. Pride and rushing. They never gave the land a moment to teach them. They just tore and hammered and shaped it how they wanted. And when it pushed back, they acted like it was unfair. Lydia's house didn't even flinch. It was the oddest thing, seeing it there, squat, low, and packed tight like a sleeping bear. The storm lashed at it with ice. Wind howled over the valley like a banshee. Some swore it shook the pine trees down to the roots. But the mud bricks didn't move. They had weight, and they had unity. One brick alone was nothing, but hundreds of them, baked dry, packed flush, were stronger than anyone expected. Men came knocking the next morning, some with frostbitten fingers, some limping from where rafters had given way. "Your chimney still standing?" they asked. Lydia answered by opening her door. The inside was warm, not fire-warm, earth-warm, trapped warmth, held in the walls like bread keeps heat in the crust. Her stove, an old rusted drum with holes patched in tin, was nearly cold, but the room held its temperature. She had thick wool draped over the walls. Her floor wasn't floor at all, just beaten clay she'd polished smooth with oil and straw. It didn't look like any home they'd seen, but it hadn't fallen. None of them said sorry. Men like that never do. But they stood around in silence longer than they needed to, squinting at the corners, at how the bricks joined, at how low the ceiling came down, just over her bed. "You'll suffocate in here," one muttered. But he didn't leave, and Lydia didn't argue. She simply made another pot of tea, set another cup down, and let the wind rattle someone else's house. The change didn't happen overnight, but cracks started forming, not in her walls, but in their confidence. A few came around asking questions, small ones, like it was just curiosity. "What did you mix in that stuff? Got horsehair in it?" "Nope." "Well, what about straw?" She nodded. "How'd you keep it from crumbling? You using some kind of glue?" Time, she said. That threw them. Most weren't used to that answer. Time wasn't something they could buy or steal or cheat. Lydia had waited out the heat, waited for each batch of bricks to cure, to shrink, to harden. She'd tested them by dropping them on stones. The ones that shattered went back to the pit. The ones that held went on the wall. A few tried it, copied her, but their hands weren't patient. Their mud was wrong. They got it from the wrong bend of the creek, where the sand was too loose. One man cursed her outright, claiming she'd lied. Lydia didn't answer. She simply made a better wall. By December, 3 more cabins had collapsed. Wet snow, poor rafters. Men started boarding with neighbors. But a whisper started moving around like smoke. Not about how her house had stood, but how it felt. One woman said it first. It's warmer than wood. That changed everything. No one believed it. It didn't make sense. Wood held heat. Everyone knew that. But what they didn't know was that wood gave it up too fast. Mud trapped it. Slow to warm, sure, but slower to let go, like a pot left near the hearth. A week later, a group of 4 men came knocking again, not just with questions, but with hands open. One of them, a father whose twin boys were sleeping on the dirt floor of a friend's barn, said, "Miss Morrow, we was wondering if maybe you'd show us how you made them bricks." She said nothing, just stepped outside, walked to the same muddy corner she'd worked all spring, and dropped her frying pan into the box. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't surrender. It was just what needed to be done. And sometimes that's all that matters. What they didn't know, what none of them did, was that Lydia wasn't building for shelter anymore. She was building for memory, for something deeper than frost or storms, for the promise she made to a face she buried 3 winters ago, a daughter who didn't live long enough to see the first brick laid. And if the world was going to laugh at her, fine, but it would do so from under broken roofs while her walls stood firm. The next storm didn't bring snow, it brought silence, the kind that made men sit still, staring at their boots longer than usual, the kind that made the mountains look taller and more distant, even when they stood right there. Ice hadn't melted, but the pride had. You could see it in how the men spoke softer, asked questions with less bark, and waited longer for answers. Lydia Morrow had become the strange sort of woman they didn't know how to stand next to, because she hadn't demanded anything, yet she'd proven them wrong without a word. By early January, the whole valley knew it. The widowed woman with the mud biscuit shack had the only home that hadn't cracked. Her garden was a ruin of frozen husks, her roof still low and crooked in places, and the door didn't even latch quite right. But the house still stood. The chimney drew smoke steady, and the walls breathed a warmth that pine and oak couldn't give. They started copying her in little ways first, smoothing their own floors with straw, trying to seal their walls with more than pitch, but you could spot the difference. Lydia's bricks had patience baked into them. Hers weren't rushed. She mixed her mud with calloused care, always from the bend by the ox stones, where the yellow clay surfaced in veins like broken pottery. She kneaded it with her forearms like bread dough, tested each batch by how it dried against her palms, and laid them down only after days under the sun. The men, they did it fast, used wheelbarrows and shovels, dried them on roofs and in cold sheds. The bricks cracked, crumbled, failed. One evening, just after the moon came up hard and white, a knock came. Again at her door, not timid, not proud, just tired. She opened it to find Samuel York standing there, big man, black beard, had once called her Muddy Mary at the creekside when she didn't answer his hello. He held his hat in both hands like it was something breakable now. "Evening, Miss Morrow," he said, eyes not quite meeting hers. "Wonder if I could look at how your roof's done. Mine gave up last night. Put 2 inches of snow on my boy's face while he slept." She studied him quietly. His jacket was stained from his own chimney soot, fingernails packed with pine pitch. One knuckle was split and bleeding. She nodded once, then stepped aside. She didn't speak while he walked the edge of her single-room house, trailing fingers along the wall joins. He crouched beneath the low ridge beam, knelt beside the stove vent, touched the packed mud over the window's lip. He didn't ask anything until he reached the far corner. "This here," he said, laying a palm against the wall. "This is packed. Feels like rock." She nodded. "You add anything to it? Sawdust? Gravel?" "Patience." He looked over at her then, face blank. She met his eyes, calm, unreadable, and finally he gave the faintest nod. "I don't got much patience left," he said, "but I'd give you a mule and a cord of dry oak if you'd show me how to make these right." Lydia didn't want the mule. She had no use for the oak, but she said yes anyway, not because she wanted to help him, but because she needed the work. Winter was long, and grief didn't pause just because you were right. Her daughter's memory was still heavy in the mornings. Her hands still ached without explanation, and showing Samuel York how to make mud bricks meant she'd be too busy to notice the ache for a few days. They started the next dawn. York's boys helped too, Elijah and Boone, both younger than 10, both skinny, with the sick, pale color of children raised in shadowy cabins. They didn't speak much, just watched. Lydia showed them how to stir the mix with feet, how to push straw through it in rope-like bunches. Boone smiled when she let him mold the corners of a new brick. Elijah never smiled. She didn't expect them to finish the walls by spring. She didn't expect gratitude. She just taught what she knew. But word spread fast. By the end of January, 4 other men had come, then 6. Some offered trade, some just brought shame and silence. One left a bolt of cloth at her doorstep after watching her stack bricks for a full hour without a single crack. But it wasn't just the storm damage that brought them. It was the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was a different kind of building waiting to be done on this land, not just with axes and timber, but with hands that knew weight, rhythm, and endurance. Lydia had never seen herself as a teacher, but now she became one. She taught them how to read the color of the mix, not too wet, not too dry, how to let the bricks sit on flat earth for 4 days, then rotate them, how to stack them under brush to keep them from frostbite, and how to listen, truly listen, for the dry, hollow thud that meant a brick was ready to hold another's weight. At first, the men tried to outwork the process. They brought bigger boxes, more mules, thicker straw. One even tried to bake the bricks in a fire pit to speed up curing. His batch cracked in 2 hours. Lydia just kept working, day after day, alongside the same dirt she'd first dug alone, now surrounded by men who still didn't understand her but had started to trust what she touched. She didn't tell them her reasons, not about Missouri, not about the daughter with black curls and a cough that stole breath like a thief, not about the spring 2 years past when her husband slipped on a wet plank and never stood again. Those stories weren't part of the brickwork, but they were in the hands that laid it. Then came February, and the thaw. But the thaw didn't bring relief. It brought collapse, not from the snow, but from the melt. Cabins built fast, high and proud. Those began to lean as the ground softened. One by one, support beams twisted. Mud poured into crawl spaces, wooden foundations sunk by inches. Some homes cracked down the middle like old crust. But Lydia's home stayed still, not because it was magic, but because it had no prideful corners. It had no brittle ribs. It had only purpose, packed layer by layer, mistake by mistake, in a shape older than memory. And it was then, after the third cabin split, that John Reeves, town council leader, ex-cavalryman, the same man who once told Lydia to stick to sewing, stood in front of her house with his hat folded at his chest. "I reckon," he said, voice flat. "You were right." Lydia said nothing. "I reckon we might need a proper brickyard for the town." Still, she waited. He looked down, cleared his throat. "Would you be willing to run it?" It was a moment she'd imagined once or twice, never because she wanted recognition, but because sometimes grief whispers in dreams that you'll get to say, "I told you so." And now that it was here, it felt nothing like victory. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, just looked at him and asked, "How many hands you got?" He blinked. "Hands? Women. I don't need men who want shortcuts. I need women who know patience." He stared a long moment, then nodded. "There's more than a few looking for something to do this side of winter. You'll have 'em." By March, the Morrow Yard was turning out 100 bricks a week. 10 women, 3 boys, one man who'd lost his thumb but found calm in pressing clay. And Lydia, at the center of it all, kept the rhythm like a heartbeat. People began to whisper a different word now. Not crazy, not muddy, not even lucky. They called her stubborn. And she liked that, because stubborn built homes that stayed warm through the dark. Stubborn meant not giving up when the soil took your best. Stubborn meant you could outlive mockery if you were willing to shape your hands around something real. But the winter wasn't done yet, and the land wasn't finished teaching. The late snows came like a betrayal, just when the women at the Morrow Yard had begun singing softly again, just when sap started to move in the branches, and the creek cracked open in places to show dark running water. The sky turned. It was the 3rd week of March, and already Lydia had laid out the spring bricks in careful rows, warming under pine bough shades, when the clouds thickened in a way she didn't trust. It wasn't just snow that worried her. It was weight. The new homes going up in the settlement were different now, lower, packed tighter, layered not with logs but with clay bricks dried over weeks. Still, most of them hadn't yet made it through a full season. Lydia knew this next storm would be the proving ground. The men had rushed again. She'd warned them, but men didn't always understand that speed and strength weren't kin. You couldn't build for pride and expect it to weather humility. She stood outside her home as the first flurries fell, watching the yard shuttered down, her apron still damp with mud. The women, Sarah Bell, old Ruthie, Marta with her cough, they'd finished curing 3 full pallets that morning. Now they were inside, oiling their hands and cooking beans over a shared fire. But Lydia didn't go in, not yet. Something in her bones told her this storm would crack more than roofs. It would split hearts too. Something final was about to break, and she wanted to face it standing up. The snow came hard by midnight, not soft flakes but wet, dragging clumps of ice that hit like gravel. Wind screamed low through the valley, taking fences and firewood stacks with it. Trees groaned and tore apart like paper, and then came the collapse. The first roof gave way just after 3 a.m., a shudder through the ground, followed by a rush of noise like something being swallowed. Then another, and another, but not from mud homes. All the old pine cabins, hastily built last summer, shattered beneath the weight. Beams bent, joists popped, rafters tore loose like ribs from flesh. One house along the North Hill slid clean off its foundation. A family barely escaped, crawling out barefoot into the snow. By sunrise, 6 more were gone. And then someone started shouting her name. "Lydia! Miss Morrow! Come quick!" She bolted from bed, boots still damp from the day before, coat half-buttoned, heart already tight. She knew it wasn't her house, but she also knew it had to do with her. It was Ruthie, breath steaming in the frozen air, tears freezing along the creases of her cheeks. She gripped Lydia's arm tight enough to bruise. "It's Marta's place. She's inside. Ruth, come down. We don't know if—" Lydia didn't wait. The 2 women ran together, skirts tangling, mud slipping beneath their feet where snow hadn't covered. The path to Marta's hut was half blown over. They pushed through it shoulder first, wind cutting their faces raw. Marta's home wasn't a full mud build. It had a brick lower half, but she hadn't waited for Lydia's help with the upper walls. Her husband, gone now, lost to the river thaw in January, had insisted on pine for the roof. It had buckled straight through. They found Marta pinned under the table. The table had taken most of the weight, but her leg was twisted under a beam. Her face was pale, eyes dazed, hair caked in soot and snow. "She's breathing," Lydia said, kneeling fast, brushing ice from Marta's forehead. "We'll need 3 to lift this." Ruthie ran for help. Lydia didn't move from Marta's side. She covered her with her own coat, hands pressed to the woman's ribs, whispering nothing, just soft sounds, just the presence of someone not gone. Within minutes, 2 more women came, Sarah Bell and young May, faces set with fear, but eyes steady. They got the beam up together, sweat freezing at their temples. Marta's scream when they pulled her free was animal, raw and terrible, but it meant she was alive. They wrapped her in wool and carried her to Lydia's house, laying her on the clay floor near the stove. Sarah started a poultice. May went to fetch clean rags. Ruthie wept softly as she heated a pan of broth. All day people came, not just women, not just those who'd built with her, even those who once called her a fool. They stood in her doorway, stunned, silent, holding bundles and blankets and whatever small apologies they had. No one dared say, "We were wrong." They just brought proof of it. Lydia's house became a shelter again, not from storms this time, but from shame, the kind that sinks deep, doesn't rot quick, and takes more than a season to unlearn. She didn't scold, she didn't preach, she just kept the fire going. By dusk, Marta was stable. Her leg would never walk quite the same again, but she was alive. The beam hadn't broken the bone clean through, just cracked it. Sarah's splint held steady. The pain was real, but so was the survival. That night, Lydia sat by the stove alone, listening to the walls. Mud didn't creak like timber. It didn't sigh or moan. It just held, quiet, honest, strong. She thought of Missouri, of the girl with the black curls who never made it to her 5th spring, of the man who slipped on wet wood and never opened his eyes again, of the long walk west with no wagon, just a rucksack, and a dream that something could still be built that wouldn't fall apart. She hadn't come west to prove anything, but now it seemed she'd proven more than she ever meant to. The next morning, the council sent word. The town meeting would be held at her home, not at the chapel, not at Reeves's bunkhouse, at her place. She almost said no, but Ruthie squeezed her arm and whispered, "Let them come. Let them see what you built without asking their permission." So she did. 23 people crammed into the little room, shoulder to shoulder, boots wiping themselves raw at the door. Lydia sat in the corner, silent, while John Reeves stood near the stove. He cleared his throat. "We've all seen what's what," he said. "Ain't no hiding from it. The old way, fast wood, tall cabins, hasty nails. It's failed us. But Miss Morrow's house, it's different. It stood. Her way stood. And I think it's time we stop calling it nonsense." There were murmurs, some nods. A few still looked down at their hands. "From now on," Reeves continued, "we'll be setting aside plots for proper mud builds. We'll use Lydia's plans. Anyone wants to learn, she'll show us." He looked at her, and for the first time in all those long, cold months, he didn't look over her head. "Miss Morrow," he said, "would you lead the new build this summer?" She looked around, at Ruthie, at Sarah, at the boys she'd taught to make bricks without cracking their fingers, at the women who'd stayed when the others fled, at Marta, resting near the stove, pale but breathing, and she said the only word she needed to. Yes. The meeting ended with quiet resolve. There were no cheers, no great declarations, just people nodding, making mental notes, remembering where they'd gone wrong. But Lydia knew the hardest part wasn't over. The hardest part wasn't the storm, it was after. The slow grind of rebuilding without forgetting why it failed the first time. And even as the sun came out that week and the snow began its final retreat, Lydia kept returning to the creek bend with her box and her frying pan, digging, shaping, laying new bricks in neat rows under the slow warming sky. The ground, she knew, would shift again someday. The wind would scream, the frost would return. But when it did, the homes would hold. Because now, the valley had learned, not just how to build, but who to listen to. That spring, the sound of axes faded from the valley, not completely. There would always be men felling trees. But now it wasn't the dominant song. It wasn't the anthem of the frontier anymore. Now you heard the slap of wet clay in molds, the swish of straw brooms over sun-baked bricks, the hollow thud of earthen blocks tested for readiness. Lydia's rhythm had replaced the old one, and the land felt quieter for it. The Morrow yard became more than a patch of dirt. It became a center, a slow-beating heart in a valley that had once only listened to the crack of timber and the ring of nails. Now, there was a stillness to the work, a hush to the labor. People didn't shout anymore while they built. They paid attention, they took their time, and above all, they listened to her. And still, Lydia never raised her voice. She gave no speeches. She offered no judgments. If someone asked, she taught. If someone mocked, she turned away. And if someone failed, and many did, especially at first, she showed them again, quietly, completely, until their hands learned. That was how she taught the children. By April, several of the younger boys and girls in the settlement began skipping their morning chores to watch the yard. They were ragged things, sun-browned and barefoot, sharp-eyed and hungry for purpose. Lydia didn't turn them away. She gave them sticks to stir the pits and tiny wooden molds to practice shaping. She let them walk between the curing rows and listen to the women hum as they brushed the clay. "Why's it gotta be so slow?" one boy asked one day, frustrated with how long it took his brick to dry. "Because rushing don't build shelter," Lydia said, kneeling beside him. "It builds a roof that'll cave on your sister while she's sleeping." The boy didn't answer, just looked down at his hands and smoothed the top of the mold more carefully. By May, there were 27 new homes underway, every one of them using bricks from her yard, and every one of them had a woman's hand in the mix. Not because Lydia had demanded it, but because the women themselves had begun to understand what they were owed. Not charity, not pity, just place, real, earned place in the bones of the town. Old Ruthie had once sewn dresses. Now her bricks were the most even of anyone's. Sarah Bell, who'd lost 2 boys in a flash flood 3 years back, now taught new families how to seal the floors tight against moisture. And Marta, walking with a cane and a limp, oversaw the new kiln Reeves built near the ridge. She lit it herself the first morning, whispering something Lydia didn't hear, and cried when the first batch came out clean. But not everyone was happy. There were still men who hated the change, who muttered behind closed doors that the valley was turning soft, that letting women lead was a mistake, that bricks were fine for stables but not for men, that clay was for the weak. Lydia heard these things, always had. One man in particular, Clem Haddocks, made a habit of saying them loud. He'd been a loud man since he arrived the year before, dragging 2 oxen and a long-suffering wife behind a cart of broken boards and whiskey crates. He built fast, drank faster, and cursed everything that didn't bend to him. When the storms destroyed his cabin in January, he blamed the snow. When the thaw took his second build, he blamed the ground. Now he blamed her. "You got everyone building huts like rats," he said one morning as he passed her yard, spitting near the curing rows. "You think just 'cause mud don't burn, it won't rot? You'll see, come next flood, this whole valley's gonna sink." Lydia said nothing, just watched him go. The women glanced at one another but didn't speak. Then 2 weeks later it rained. Not a spring drizzle, a flood rain. The sky turned greenish-gray, the wind went still, and the birds vanished. Lydia stood barefoot at the edge of her yard as the first drops came, fat and warm. She felt them in her bones before they hit her skin, like a warning. The earth under her toes trembled, not from thunder, but from the weight of what was coming. It rained for 36 hours straight. By the second day, the creek had broken its banks. By nightfall, the low fields were gone. And by dawn of the third day, the cabins on the southern edge, those still standing on timber beams, started to groan. Lydia walked out through the mud, skirts soaked to her knees, hair plastered to her shoulders, watching the water rise. She saw Clem Haddocks on his roof, trying to lash down a tarpaulin that was already torn free. "Bricks'll float, huh?" he shouted, half laughing, half daring her. Lydia didn't answer. She was too busy checking her walls. Her own house, low to the ground, was wrapped in the runoff, but not leaking. The walls held, the clay held, the foundation, the one she'd built by burying crushed stone beneath the first layer, held. Sarah Bell's house? Held. Marta's? Held. Ruthie's? Dry as firewood. But Clem's, by noon, it was gone. The beams twisted, the floor dropped, and the whole roof slid into the current like a drowned dog. No one cheered, no one mocked, but people started carrying their things to higher ground. And that ground? It was her yard. Within hours, the Morrow yard became the new high place. A dozen families came with bundles, sacks, crying children, wet boots, and desperate eyes. Lydia's house was too small to hold them all, but her kiln shed wasn't. They packed in under the drying racks. They wrapped themselves in cured straw mats and waited out the rain, listening to the storm chew away what was left of the old ways. And when the flood finally receded, when the sun pushed through the torn clouds like an old friend who'd been away too long, the homes that still stood were the ones she'd helped raise. 24 of them. Not a single brick home had been lost. By the end of the week, Clem was sleeping in a tent. Not even his oxen had a proper shelter. His wife, silent and distant, had already moved into one of the widow homes up the ridge. He came to Lydia, finally, with nothing in his hands. "You win," he said. She looked at him, long and hard, then turned away. This wasn't a contest. "You gonna help me or not?" "I already did," she said, nodding at the empty patches of earth near the yard. "Twice, and you didn't listen." He didn't answer, just stood there in wet boots, staring at her bricks like they were puzzle pieces he couldn't solve. She didn't need him to. That summer, something happened no one expected. The governor's scout arrived. He came riding hard, asking after the settlement, said the capital was sending out a surveyor to map the region for future expansion, asked for a list of names, structures, any public works. Lydia wasn't there when he arrived, but word spread fast. When he saw the Morrow yard, when he saw the kiln, the rows of homes built, flush to the slope, the women teaching children to stamp straw into clay, he asked who was in charge. They pointed to her. He blinked. "A woman?" No one answered. He walked up to her while she was checking a new rack of drying bricks, boots caked in dust, hat still on his head like he didn't quite know what to do with it. "Miss Morrow," he said, offering a nod. "They tell me this yard is yours." "It's theirs," she said, nodding toward the women. "I just got it started." He looked around. He didn't understand what he was seeing, not fully, but he could feel it, the quiet, the order, the solidity of it all. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "you've done something remarkable here. The capital will want a record. Would you be willing to have your name listed as the founding builder?" She didn't answer right away. It wasn't pride that made her pause. It wasn't humility either. It was something deeper, something older, the memory of a cabin collapsing in Missouri, of a girl coughing through a fever with nothing but drafty pine to keep her warm, of a husband bleeding out under rotted rafters, of being told over and over that her work was women's nonsense. She turned to the scout, eyes calm, hands dirty with her latest batch. "List the yard," she said. "Not my name, just the work." And that was how the Morrow yard became legend, not through headlines, not through songs, just through brick and time and patience, the same way Lydia had built everything that lasted. Summer stretched out dry and golden across the valley, but for the first time in memory, no one feared the heat. It passed gently over rooftops that didn't creak. It baked bricks that didn't buckle. And when it rolled back at dusk with the long blue shadows, it found homes still standing, cool inside, calm and shaded, built not with bravado, but with patience. The women at the Morrow yard worked like they'd always been building, like the skill had never been missing, only overlooked. They joked sometimes, in quiet tones, that they were just doing what men refused to learn. But even that bitterness had softened. What remained wasn't pride exactly, it was endurance, and a knowledge that you didn't need to shout for your work to be seen. Eventually, even the deafest man noticed what didn't fall down. Lydia's house was no longer alone. It sat now among 32 others, each one low, strong, and cool-walled, every window framed in the same packed earth blend that once made men laugh. New families arrived in May and June, drawn by whispers that this place had something special. Not gold, not cattle, just stability. They brought old mothers, wives with quiet hands, sons who listened, daughters with sleeves rolled high and eyes already scanning the soil for clay veins. These newcomers asked questions, and they asked them with respect. The brick schoolhouse broke ground in early August. That was Sarah Bell's doing. She'd lost her own boys, but she'd made something out of that grief, turned it into ambition, into fire. She led the effort without waiting for permission, drew plans, laid the foundation herself with 2 teenage girls from the North Ridge. When John Reeves asked if she needed help, she told him plainly, "Yes, and not just your hands, "Your ears." So he listened, and for the first time he didn't try to lead, he followed. The schoolhouse was framed with the same principles Lydia taught: packed earth bricks on a wide base, straw mud plaster to seal gaps, small windows facing east for morning light and warmth. The ceiling was shallow, the roof sod-layered and sealed with flat stones. It wasn't beautiful in the way churches were supposed to be, but it worked, and that became the new standard. Not beauty, not ceremony, function. Homes that held heat, roofs that didn't weep in storms, walls that didn't fall. By the end of the summer, Clem Haddocks was still living in a tent, not because he couldn't rebuild, he'd been offered help, but because no one trusted him to build with them. Trust, it turned out, had to be earned one brick at a time, and no one wanted a rotten beam laid next to their wall. Lydia passed him sometimes in the market. He looked older, smaller. She didn't say a word. But once, when she bought a bolt of muslin and found her coins short, a hand reached in from behind and placed a silver piece on the table. She turned. It was Clem. He didn't speak, just nodded once and walked away. That was enough. It was never about punishment. Lydia had never wanted revenge, only space. Space to build what worked. Space to prove the land could be shaped with hands that weren't fists. And now, standing beside rows of drying bricks under a sky that finally held no threat, she knew she'd gotten that. Then came the child. Not hers. She would never have another. But he was left on her porch in late September, a note pinned to the blanket in a woman's handwriting, scrawled, stiff but careful. "His name is Isaac. I can't keep him. Please raise him strong." There was no signature, just the baby, wrapped tight, face red and quiet. Lydia stood there for a long time. She didn't cry. She took him inside, wrapped him in wool, fed him goat's milk with a spoon, and placed him in the same old box she used to cure her bricks in years ago, softened with cloth, ringed with straw. It wasn't a cradle, but it was strong. It was warm. It was hers. The next morning, she carried Isaac to the yard. "Is that yours?" Ruthie asked gently. "No," Lydia said, "but I'm his." That day, a dozen women came by with small gifts: a rattle, a boiled root, a bundle of clean rags, a quilt folded in a basket. No one asked where he came from. No one asked why she was taking him in. It was understood a child in a mud brick home was safer than in most arms. And Isaac, for all his smallness, became something the town hadn't had in years. A symbol, not of triumph, but of continuance, of something rooted deeper than foundation stone. Lydia held him close each night, whispering names of plants, wind currents, seasons. Not because he understood, but because she knew someday he would. By late autumn, the governor's man returned. He came with papers this time, official ones, declarations of territory recognition, proposals for land grants. He asked for Lydia by name. She met him in the yard, boots muddy, Isaac on her hip. "We want to designate this place," he said, "as a model settlement. Your work here, it stabilized the entire northern edge of the range. We'd like to fund a road, maybe bring in engineers to study your bricks, perhaps even formalize a title for you." Lydia just looked at him. "Titles don't hold up roofs." "No," he said, "but they open doors." She shook her head. "This valley doesn't need more doors, just stronger walls." He nodded. He didn't understand, but he accepted it. Before he left, he asked if she had any message for the governor. She said, "Tell him a woman's nonsense is what's keeping this place from blowing away." And that was the end of it. No monument was raised, no statue carved. But a year later, when the governor himself came through and saw the home still standing, the fields walled with earth, the schoolhouse cool even in August, the creek flowing alongside roads that never turned to mud, he nodded once and ordered his men to name the ridge above the valley. They called it Morrow Rise. The name wasn't official, but it stuck. It was etched into the stone above the schoolhouse, painted on the side of the kiln, scratched into the beam above the general store. And Lydia, she never spoke of it. She spent her days working the yard, her nights holding Isaac, and her years quietly watching the children grow up in homes that didn't leak, collapse, or betray them. Her hair went silver, her back bent slightly, but her hands never lost their shape, still calloused, still strong, still dusted with the dry remains of what she'd taught others to build from nothing. And when she died, many winters later, the town didn't hold a loud funeral. They held a brick, one each. Every person walked to the yard, now triple the size it had once been, and laid a single brick in a ring around the curing ground. No names were read, no speeches given, just the sound of clay on clay. And when the ring was finished, Isaac, grown tall now, voice steady, hands like hers, placed a final brick at the center. No writing on it, no carving, just weight, just presence, just proof. Because sometimes a brick says everything. And Lydia Morrow, who once mixed her mud with a frying pan, who was mocked for making biscuit homes, who built something the wind could not break, had already said all she ever needed to. The valley never forgot, and no one ever called it nonsense again.